Hey everyone, and welcome to the Book Fight Club, the podcast where we bring amazing people into the ring for exclusive duels. Here we're going to take a deep dive into their incredible journeys as we do you a favor and read the memoirs. I'm Mélanie Duat, a regular dumb French girl, so please forgive my bad syntax and thick Parisian accent. Bienvenue au club. These two are game changers. They empowered the digital revolution by inventing the tools that have come to dominate our lives in less than 30 years. Geniuses, rebels, and self-made men, they've built bridges between high technology, knowledge, and beauty. While their human natures differ, their journeys share many milestones. On my left, Steve Jobs, deceased in 2011 at the age of 56 with 656 pages. On my right, Xavier Niel, 57 years old with 304 pages. Let's start the battle. May the most revolutionary win. First round, the context. The biography of Steve Jobs was published in 2011 by Walter Isaacson, a highly recognized journalist who has written many well-documented biographies, including those of Henry Kissinger, Albert Einstein, and more recently, Elon Musk. In the introduction, he recalls how Steve Jobs himself reached out to offer him the honor of writing his memoir. Isaacson refused, thinking that Jobs was only in the middle of his life. But when Jobs' health problems became public in 2009, Jobs' wife called and said, "If you want to write the book, do it now." He writes, "To my surprise, Steve Jobs agreed not to exercise any control over the text. He didn't even demand to see the proofs before release. The result is an authorized yet uncensored biography, very well documented, and it is fascinating to read, as we discover just how unique Jobs was." Isaacson explains, "This book traces the chaotic and intense career of an extraordinary personality and entrepreneur of genius whose penchant for perfection and iron will revolutionized 6 entire sectors of the modern economy: microcomputers, animated film, music, telephony, graphic tablets, and digital publishing. We could even add a seventh: retail. With his Apple Store, Jobs didn't revolutionize the concept of stores, he completely reinvented it." Une sacrée envie de foutre le bordel, which could be translated as a damn urge to make a mess, was published in 2024 and is a transcript of in-depth conversations between Xavier Niel and Jean-Louis Misica. The latter is a longtime friend of Niel's and an experienced player in the French media political scene. Leftist but pro-business, he has worked in many public institutions, ministries, or mayor's offices, as well as on many corporate boards. In his intro, he explains how he met Xavier Niel at the turn of the millennium. "I was working as a consultant for a venture capital fund when I received a brief from a company that wanted to build a kind of box. A box that would be installed in the subscriber's home and through which the internet, telephone, and television would pass. The startup in question was called Free, and its brief had everything to displease me. Its business plan was outrageous, with plans to win 100% share of the telecom market. Most importantly, its strategy was to produce millions of electronic boxes using technologies that didn't exist, at least not yet. So he met Niel, thinking, what kind of a madman is this? In less than an hour, he managed to convince me that his idea wasn't completely crazy. 20 years later, Free is no longer just a startup, and Xavier Niel is no longer just its founder. He invented a school without teachers, created the world's largest startup incubator, bought media companies, invested in hundreds of companies, and was voted France's favorite boss. He's a French self-made man like few others. So I wanted to understand, and the best way to understand is to discuss. This book is not a biography in the strict sense of the word. It's a conversation between friends, trying to define a man's personality, his choices, his questions, his regrets, his hopes. He goes on to write, "For all those who, like me, feel that they don't live on the same planet as Elon Musk, Xavier Niel is reassuring." And he's right, as we'll see. So the two of them have a lively exchange on a whole range of topics, which they have turned into a book that was, I must admit, a very nice read and taught me a lot. Second round, the origins. Steve Jobs was born in 1955 in San Francisco, California, from the love affair between a student, Johann Schiebel, and a lecturer, Abdul Fattah Jandali, at the University of Wisconsin. Both were 23 at the time, but Johan's father objected to the union because Abdul Fattah, of Syrian origin, is a Muslim. The couple decided to put their child up for adoption. Paul Jobs and his wife Clara adopted the baby. With no formal education, Paul is a mechanic and Clara, of Armenian descent, is an accountant, Johann agreed to entrust them with a baby in return for a promise to set up a fund to send the boy to university. Young Steve knew from an early age that he was adopted. When a young neighbor innocently asked him, "Didn't your real parents want you?" the boy ran home crying, and his adoptive parents had this beautiful response: "No, you don't understand. We chose you." It was a seminal moment in the young Job's psyche. Isaacson writes, "Abandoned, chosen, these two words became inextricably linked to Job's personality and the way he saw his place in the world." Paul and Clara proved to be loving parents, and Jobs himself said, "Knowing I was adopted may have made me more independent, but I never felt abandoned, just different. It was my parents who gave me that strength. They were the ones who convinced me that I was special. They were 1,000% my parents." The Jobs family moved to Mountain View, south of Palo Alto, where his father worked as a salvager for a loan company, meaning that he broke into the cars of people who hadn't paid their installments and confiscated the vehicles. And he's got gold in his hands. He's an excellent mechanic and handyman and spends a lot of time at his workbench with little Steve, who is eager to learn. Although Steve has little interest in cars, it's through them that he catches the electronics bug. But what the kid loves most are the trips to the junkyard to pick up parts. Watching his father, he learns the art of haggling and how to keep his margin pretty healthy. The Jobs house was built by developer Joseph Eichler, who spread simple, functional homes throughout California from the 50s to the 70s. The architecture is simple yet functional with its large open spaces. This pure aesthetic, designed for the masses, really impressed the young Jobs, fueling his obsession with design. Silicon Valley was really thriving at the time, with lots of high-tech industries like semiconductors, many of which were working with the military. As it happens, it was during a visit to NASA's weapon base that Steve first saw a computer. "I grew up surrounded by the history of the place," Jobs said. "Most of the dads in my neighborhood worked in cutting-edge industries like photovoltaic cells, batteries, and radar." Xavier Niel was born in 1967 in the Paris suburb of Maison-Alfort to a lawyer father and an accountant mother. He says his childhood was the happiest in the world, in a close-knit family. And that's where we can see that it reinforced the unshakable foundations of his unshakable optimism. Maybe it also gave him a knack of nuance seeking. "My mother was more right-wing yet progressist, and my father was more left-wing but also Catholic." He says his parents were very different but still got along well. She was more logical and responsible, while he was more of a dreamer and an eternal student. He grew up in Créteil, where his maternal grandparents settled, leaving Paris to find fresh air. Créteil was still the countryside then, before becoming one of those mushrooming dormitory towns known as Ville Nouvelle at the height of Les Trente Glorieuses, this golden era of growth between the end of the war and before the first oil crisis in the early 70s. Xavier's parents also left Paris to move into the house adjoining the grandparents. It was a dream for little Xavier, who came home for lunch every day to Grandma and Grandpa, who pampered their grandchildren. An idyllic picture of a loving, well-balanced family. Except for the fact that the grandfather isn't exactly a loosey-goosey kind of a guy, and everything goes smoothly under his law. He runs a wholesale butcher shop in Les Halles, is borderline short-tempered, hates Mitterrand, and thinks the best of the young Jean-Marie Le Pen, the far right-wing leader we're starting to see on TV. But young Xavier respects his grandfather enormously, not least for his work ethic, as he starts his rounds every morning at 3 a.m. In short, Niel describes a time that sadly seems to have disappeared, when a family could get along very well despite radically opposing political beliefs. He says he no longer wants to talk about his humble origin because it offends his mother. She was right. My parents gave everything to their children. What I meant was that the budget was tight. Round 3, self-education. Steve Jobs' mother taught him to read before he entered elementary school. This precociousness set him apart from his classmates, and young Steve is bored at school. So he plays the fool, pulling pranks like putting up Bring Your Pet posters around the school, finding it very funny to see the school invaded by dogs chasing cats. In fourth grade, his teacher gets him to do extra math in exchange for a lollipop and $5. So American. After a few months, the boy does the math exercises willingly without any reward. I was just happy to learn and happy to make her happy. By the end of the year, his teacher gives him tests to assess his level. The results are clear. In fourth grade, Steve Jobs has the level of a seventh grader. The school suggests that he skips 2 grades, but his parents decide it would be wiser to send him in the sixth grade in a public high school not far away, but in a crappy area. Middle school is rough, and it's worse than you'd think. Gang warfare, violence, racketeering. When you arrive at school, a group of students has just been arrested for gang rape. Jobs is regularly beaten up and ends up demanding that his parents move him to another school. Jobs' parents decide to move to a better neighborhood in the district of a well-respected and, above all, safe middle school. In high school, Steve is exposed to the late 60s counterculture while hanging out with seniors. It's a meeting of two worlds, geeks and hippies. They are interested in physics and electronics, but also in LSD. The teenager also spends a lot of time with a neighbor, a Hewlett-Packard engineer who got him interested in electronics assembly kits. He also introduces him to the HP Explorers Club, which gathers about 15 students every week in the company cafeteria to familiarize them with engineering. For me, the highlight was seeing the first desktop computers that HP was developing. The 9100A. It was more of a calculator than a microcomputer, but it was still pretty impressive. It was a 20-kilogram beast. To me, it was the most beautiful thing. When he asks to work on a personal project, he needs specific components. So he looks in the phone book for Bill Hewlett's number and gives him a call, tranquillou bilou, as we say in France, or as you may say, easy peasy. Hewlett is impressed by the young man's audacity and brilliance. He gets him the parts he needs and a summer job at the HP factory, where he works on an assembly line. Jobs is definitely a workaholic from the start. He's got all kinds of gigs, like working in a warehouse for an electronics store, which is basically heaven for him. He spends his high school years smoking weed and discovering music and literature with his hippie friends. He also follows the electronics course of a former US Navy pilot. That's how he meets Stefan Wozniak, a former student of the same electronics course who is 5 years older. The two hit it off right away from their common passion for electronics despite their differences. Wozniak is an introvert, shy and lonely, but also an incredible prodigy in electronics, working on conceiving computers that cost half as much as the ones on the market. Jobs remembers, Woz was the first person I met who knew more about electronics than I did. I liked him immediately. They also share the same taste in music, especially when it comes to Bob Dylan. At the end of high school, Jobs decided not to go to university, but his parents promised his biological mother they'd save up enough to provide their son a higher education. So they insist. He finally chooses a very expensive private university far from home, Reed College in Portland, Oregon. On his first day, the ungrateful brat forbids his parents to come with him. Decades later, he deeply regrets his behavior. They did everything they could to get me there, but I didn't want them around. I wanted not to have parents. I wanted to be the orphan who crossed the country by train, coming from nowhere. a virgin being, without roots, without relationships, and without a past. In Reed, the anti-Vietnam War movement recedes in favor of individual spiritual quests. Jobs starts walking around barefoot and becomes obsessed with meditation, personal awakening, psychedelic drugs, and all the cultish bullshit that has unfortunately flourished since. He begins to develop serious eating disorders, not because he's obsessed with his figure, he couldn't care less, but because he's addicted to the delirium of hunger. He stops eating meat, multiplies purgings, fasts, and ends up obsessively eat only one or two elements as carrots or apples for weeks. He reads all the books from naturopaths and other swindlers who sell ridiculous but mostly dangerous theories about the pseudo-harms of an omnivore and balanced diet. Sadly, we'll see that this cuckoo banana mindset played a role in his early passing. Of course, he falls for the crap of a cult leader and his little enlightened crew living on a farm outside of Portland. But Jobs quickly realizes that the commune is a scam. On the academic front, it's shit, because Jobs is bored as hell in a classics curriculum. Basically, he doesn't give a damn about reading Greek classics. So he drops out and goes back to mom and dad in Palo Alto, where he gets a job at a new video game company, Atari. He loves his job, but he has a crazy theory that because of his peculiar, not to say delirious, diet, his body can't produce odor, allowing him to avoid showers and deodorants. Yes, you understood well. He is a disgusting, dirty, smelly hell. And his coworkers suffocate around him, also because he openly despises them, calling them stupid all day long. But the boss likes him. The kid is weird, sure, arrogant, absolutely, but also so brilliant. And he's allowed to work at night alone. He learns a lot from his experience and falls in love with the simplicity and intuitiveness of Atari games, which came without manuals. But in 74, Jobs' cult leader still has a hold on him and persuades him to make his initiation trip to India. He manages to get funding from Atari, who needs someone to deal with technical issues in Europe. In Germany, he's disgusted by the local gastronomy based on sausages and potatoes. Well, as a French girl, I can't disagree. German food is not the finest. When he arrives in New Delhi, he gets sick from drinking tap water and loses 20 kilos in the first week. Whoa. Once he's healed, he goes to the source of Ganges River to join a big religious celebration with no less than 10 millions of pilgrims. It's a bit much for this misanthrope, and he quickly flees to find a commune at the foot of the Himalayas. He spends 7 months wandering from one commune to another in search of enlightenment. When he finally returns home, his parents don't recognize him with his burnt tan, shaved head, and bright sari. Still at his quest, he tries meditation, studies Zen, and even gives primal scream therapy a shot, just like John Lennon. He also takes courses in physics and electronics at Stanford. He goes back to work at Atari, who asks him to design a one-player version of their star game Pong. He works with his old buddy Wozniak, who works at HP at the time. They deliver in record time, and Jobs steals the promised bonus from Wozniak, a fact that Jobs still denies 40 years later. At school, little Xavier is okay with being just average. School for me was so boring. I had a kind of a silent contract with my father. I had to get a 12 on 20 average score, and I always respected the deal. He's not a fan of recess either, being very shy, lonely. He spends his time by reading, drawing, and playing with Legos. In middle school, things get tough because his neighborhood is pretty shitty. When I was 11, my friends brought guns at school when others fought with knives. He explains. The transformation of Créteil was brutal. Thousands of people came from all over in a very short time. Assimilation was ongoing, but sometimes it was difficult. In middle school, it was explosive. You learn to misbehave quickly. One day, he comes home from school with a bloody face, and his parents decide to transfer him to a nearby Catholic private school. Xavier doesn't do better there. I wasn't bad, but I wasn't good either. School just wasn't for me. He already knows that he doesn't want to waste his time by studying. What he wants is to earn money, a lot of money. So he starts his business in his sophomore year, using his passion for IT and coding skill he's already developed. When he turns 14, his dad gives him his first computer, a Sinclair ZX81. His dad supports his passion by buying him specialized magazines, and he learns to code on his own. When he's 16, his dad gives him the best of the best computer at the time. I let you guess, an Apple II. Niel remembers, I can connect it to a model that connects me to people who share my passion. We communicate and exchange programs. It is like a real community. At the same time, the Minitel is launched, and I can connect my computer to it. I start to create services pages for the Minitel, and before I know it, I'm learning how to take over a page and just messing around. At the time, it was just a game for me. Here, I have to explain what was the Minitel. It was an individual computer terminal, and it was the first service in the world to provide access to a variety of services that foreshadowed those to be found on the internet. It used the French Transpac network, which was one of the early versions of the internet, and it added access points through the telephone network. It was a real game changer, and by 1993, a whopping 6.5 million French households had it. I remember it very well. We used it to look up the yellow pages or buy train tickets, and I even checked my high school graduation results in 99, even though we already had a computer hooked up to the internet. In Niel's opinion, the Minitel was a miracle for France, who missed by an inch the opportunity to dominate a globalized network just before the internet era. But unfortunately, it didn't make it. The government's support for the Minitel didn't help, and the monopolistic operator was only focused on keeping its profits high. On top of that, the French administration wasn't really up to the task of promoting and exporting such a disruptive innovation. Round 4. Pirates. Young Steve Jobs also plays around, flirting dangerously with illegality. With Wozniak still in high school, he designs a blue pirate box to make free long-distance phone calls by mimicking the tones that carry the signals of the AT&T telephone network. They use it to pull silly pranks, such as Wozniak calling the Vatican and imitating Henry Kissinger to ask to speak to the Pope. But Jobs quickly figures out how to make a profit and sells 100 of their boxes with a pretty nice margin. After Apple's launch, Xerox wants to invest in that promising startup. In 79, Jobs offers the giant a deal. I let you invest $1 million if you show me what you do in the park. Xerox has created the Palo Alto Research Center in the Valley in 70. It was an innovation incubator with the top engineers working on graphical interfaces to replace command lines, or the desk as we know it, with files and documents that can be moved and opened thanks to a computer mouse. This major innovation is possible thanks to bitmapping, a Park innovation and Xerox patent. By the end of 79, Jobs and his crew are invited to the park. When Jobs finds out they don't show him all Park's treasures, he loses it and harasses Xerox headquarters to get what he came for. A full demo of Smalltalk, the object-oriented programming language that enables computers to be networked, and the famous graphical interface with its matrix image. Jobs cannot believe that Xerox doesn't profit from this golden nugget, so he will. This expedition is often described as the biggest industrial heist in history, and Jobs is proud about it. He says Picasso had a maxim for this: good artists copy, great artists steal. And it's true. Apple engineers and designers really improved the stolen technology. In fact, if Jobs' audacity does the job, it is also Xerox's monumental mistake to have missed out the chance to be the leader in the computing industry by wasting its own precious resources. The spirit of piracy would animate Jobs and his troops throughout Apple's history. Except that if Jobs is going to take full advantage of open source and even not hesitate to plunder, he certainly wasn't going to share and triple locks his machines. In fact, Jobs wields the rebel and pirate spirit as much as a marketing tool to position Apple as a David against the Goliath that are IBM, then Microsoft, and its machines, those of artists and protesters. The ad for the Macintosh launch in '84, directed by Ridley Scott, who has just released Blade Runner, is clearly inspired by George Orwell's futuristic novel 1984, with Big Blue, IBM's nickname, as Big Brother, and Apple as a revolutionary slave. Jobs also uses the pirate spirit as a management tool, in a cultish way, to get his crew, who are supposed to be working for good against evil, to commit and be loyal. At the Apple seminar in '83, just after the release of the Lisa, which he has lost interest in, Jobs is in the midst of an internal battle to develop his own baby, the Macintosh. He tells his team it's better to be a pirate than to join the Navy. The team hoists a black skull and crossbones flag with the Apple logo in one of its orbits. Team Lisa steals it, but Team Mac gets it back. It's a bit immature, but it keeps the team engaged. In France, young Xavier Niel is learning his trade on the Minitel, and it's not exactly legal. He remembers. We pirate stuff, create messaging systems to talk to each other. He starts selling Canal Plus pirate decoders. You could make a decoder with an electronic board, a couple of components, and a bit of soldering. We are just kids, we don't realize. And we aren't discreet. We sell them on Minitel as we have our own ecosystem of pirate forums. He also deals in floppy disks. We go to each other's house to copy them, they are American games, and we pirate and duplicate them on floppy disks. He makes a few friends, mostly rich kids, because at the time computers are very expensive, and he hangs out with them in the catacombs of Paris, which is again not very legal. There was a connection between the two, computer piracy and the piracy of the city, through these underground strolls. He gets caught when Canal Plus presses charges, and the police has no trouble finding him since he is running a store on the Minitel in plain sight. He is only 17, and he gets summoned to Place Beauvau, which is the Ministry of Interior's headquarters, to meet a commissioner who specializes in counterfeiting. The commissioner is eager to learn more about computer piracy and how it works. When I talk to her, I realize I'm not doing anything illegal. Nobody has ever thought that hackers could exist. It isn't even a legal vacuum, it just doesn't exist. He's free, but she calls him back to set him up with an agent from the DST, that's the French Secret Service. The guy is setting up a new department dedicated to hacking. He puts a little pressure on young Niel by taking him on a tour of the interrogation cells in the basement of the DST's headquarters, to make it clear that it's in his interest to cooperate with his new cybersecurity service. Niel explains. It's 1984, still the Cold War. They're interested in a French and Russian bank, so I get into the computer system. Another time is off on a mission to copy an African diplomat's computer while the agents search the room and put everything back in place. It's just like in The Bureau, the excellent French series about secret services that you should binge immediately. Well, after you finish listening to my podcast, of course. It's incredible. Niel is only 20 when he hacks into the phone of Mitterrand's official car, which turns out to be a pretty shady move by the DST to get a budget extension. Anyway, Xav is extremely clever. He works for companies that want to create Minitel services and is doing well for himself. Back in '87, when he is just 20, he buys out his first company in bankruptcy. AZ Telematic, which nevertheless has 500 employees and manages Minitel services for big companies and institutions. Then he enters the low-cost hosting market for Minitel services. He also launches the Minitel Rose. He explains. Not everyone could publish services on Minitel. The press groups have the monopoly. At a local newspaper, Les Dernières Nouvelles d'Alsace, someone has a great idea of creating a service where people can exchange messages. Realize that while people aren't too interested in information services, they are more into sites where people could chat. And so the Minitel Rose is born. It was all text messages, no images or videos, and nothing like what we see on the internet today. When I see that, I think, hey, I can do Minitel dating too. In a nutshell, he invents Tinder's ancestor. His business model is pretty simple. He buys ad space in traditional media to promote their Minitel services. They split the ad revenue 50-50 with the media companies. He dynamites the competition with his win-win model. But in doing so, he hooks up with a mobster who owns sex shops in Paris to advertise his Minitel Rose, which works, when the mobster's Minitel is loss-making. Since the guy is losing a lot of money, young Niel, who is starting to feel the strain of taxes, thinks it might be a good idea to take a 50% stake in his company. He drops the prep school he doesn't care about. I realize that my studies are going to be useless. They're preparing me to become an engineer. And at 19 years old, I already have engineers on my payroll. My first month's salary as a boss is 200,000 francs, about 29,000 euros. So, of course, I learn everything on the job. In 96, he has the genius idea of creating the 3617 ANU, reverse lookup directory. France Telecom has an electronic directory. The problem is that when you ask them for the database, they say it was 100 million and not for sale. So we figure if they don't want to share with us, we'll just pirate it. We line up 200 Minitels connected to computers. They connect to the directory in less than 3 minutes, since the first 3 minutes are free. So we download all the data and reprocess it to create a reverse lookup directory. It's an instant jackpot. Niel finds himself sitting on a pile of gold that will enable him to launch free. Round 5, the genius ID. In 75, in Silicon Valley, Popular Mechanics magazine features the very first kit microcomputer, the Altair. The thing is a mess, expensive with lots of components that require a lot of soldering for a mediocre result. But it drives geeks batshit crazy, including Wozniak, Jobs, and a little further north from California in Seattle, a certain Bill Gates and his buddy Paul Allen, who set about writing the first software for the Altair. Wozniak joins a club of enthusiasts, the Homebrew Computer Club, whose members' ultimate goal is to build their own computer. When Wozniak discovers the datasheet for a microprocessor, which is a chip that integrates a complete computing unit, he has a vision. By integrating such microprocessor into the terminal consisting of a screen and keyboard that he has already designed to connect to a remote computer, he would be able to build an all-in-one desktop computer almost as we know it today. He finds a way around Intel's overpriced microprocessors, which makes his first computer incompatible with the rest of the market right from the start. He works like a madman and designs the Apple I all by himself. Jobs is amazed when he witnesses the first test and sees the characters typed on the keyboard appear on the screen. The duo run to present the new machine to the club. Wozniak wants to share the plans for his creation in keeping with the club's hacker ethos, but Jobs has the idea of selling the machine already assembled. The two sell their few possessions to raise $3,000 in startup capital and set up shop in Jobs' parents' garage. About this amazing time and the creative energy that fuels the IT sector, which is about to boom, I recommend you binge a great series rather overlooked, at least in France. Halt and Catch Fire. It's about a group of engineers and tech geeks who are passionate about breaking into the market while they're dealing with capitalist constraints and that spirit of piracy so fundamental to the digital pioneers back then. But let's go back to the beginning of Apple computers. The name comes from Jobs, who often hangs in an apple orchard as part of his obsessive fruitarian diet. It's a simple, cool, quirky, but humble name that also places them ahead of Atari in the phone book. It also echoes the counterculture with its call to return to nature. In short, a stroke of genius. On April 1st of 76, a meeting is held to get the ball rolling with Wozniak, who's still at HP, Jobs, and Ron Wayne, an engineer at Atari. Wayne is recruited by Jobs, who has a hunch that he'd need someone to decide between him and Wozniak. Wayne writes up the contract, laying out the basics of their partnerships and how shares and profits would be split. 45% each for Wozniak and Jobs, 10% for Wayne. But Wayne gets cold feet after his last entrepreneurial attempt with slot machines went south. So he gives up his partnership and 10% share. That's about $345 billion. The guy ends up penniless but with no regrets. A similar fate to Stuart Sutcliffe's The Fifth Beatle. He was the band's bassist from 1960 to 61, but he left to focus on his art studies. He died tragically in 62, just before the Beatles' global explosion. That is what we call a bad beat. Ultimately, it's Mike Markula, a guy who hit the jackpot with his stock options when Intel went public, who's going to be the third name on the board, bringing in the much needed funds to get the company off the ground. But let's go back to the Apple I launch. In September 76, Jobs and his crew set up a makeshift booth at the first microcomputer show in Atlantic City on the East Coast. Jobs checks out the competition and has an epiphany. The Apple II, which Wozniak is already tinkering with, has to be all-inclusive: keyboard, monitor, power supply, and all. That's when Steve Jobs' marketing genius really shines through. He's going for a simple, elegant design that would stand out from the dull, grey middle competitors. Whilst he's browsing through a department store, he falls in love with the design of Cuisinart food processors, which are made of molded white plastic. He also doesn't want to integrate a fan, which would be noisy and therefore not Zen-like. It takes all Wozniak's genius to design a power supply that would store energy for less time and therefore dissipate less heat. The Apple II is presented at the first San Francisco Computer Show in 77. This time, Jobs wants to take care of the form to create maximum buzz. Isaacson writes, Apple had a black velvet counter and a big backlit plexiglass panel with the XXL logo. They only displayed the 3 Apple IIs that Wozniak has completed, but they stacked empty boxes behind the counter to make it look like they had a whole stock on hand. And it works. They live with 300 firm orders and a retailer in Japan. The Apple II is a huge success, launching Apple into the big leagues. It becomes a real company with a staff of 10 and enough credit capacity to move out that garage and set up shop in Cupertino. Apple goes public in 1980 and Jobs becomes very rich. But he doesn't care, obsessed as he is with creating the world's best products. His inflated ego and insufferable personality has already shaken the company, and he agrees early on to hand over the reins and the CEO job to one of Markula's buddies, Mike Scott, whose main mission is to channel Jobs' craziness. Now that he can focus on development full-time, Jobs wants to create his own baby, since the Apple II was seen as Wozniak's creation. This is the Macintosh, which is revolutionary in graphic terms with its widescreen background and pixel-by-pixel character display. Its launch in '84 is a historical event with Jobs' first famous keynote, another stroke of genius that he repeats at every product launch. His secret sauce involves teasing the press in advance, giving exclusive interviews to handpicked journalists, and creating a big show with Ridley Scott's cutting edge film. He also shows off his own charisma and amazing storytelling skills. After this spectacular launch, Jobs becomes a global star. There will be plenty of other brilliant ideas, more or less successfully executed. One example is the digitization of knowledge with his next company, which is aimed at the university market. This is during his desert crossing outside the Apple Fold. It is a flop, with a machine that is way too expensive. But Jobs never gives up. He bounces back with Pixar, a spin-off from the IT department of Lucasfilm. George Lucas production company, which has just hit it big with Star Wars. In '84, Lucas needs cash to pay for his divorce, and Jobs, who had just made a killing with his Apple chairs, has plenty. So he invests massively and takes over the presidency of the small company, which is then working on a computer that could digitize images to create special effects and does some digital animation. Jobs has a rare respect for the Pixar team. This unique partnership between Silicon Valley and Hollywood leads to the golden nugget, which is Pixar, and Jobs is its biggest champion during negotiation with the giant Disney. By '96, Apple is a mess without Jobs. Microsoft has overtaken them in the graphical user interface department with their Windows 3. Apple panics while Jobs rages about what has happened to his baby. He comes up with a plan to make his comeback and convinces the Apple board, who is pretty worried about the situation, to buy Next, giving him a seat on the board. He comes back as a consultant with the goal of making history. He starts by cleaning up projects and teams. He stops the brain drain by re-evaluating the price of stock options and completely overhauls the board of directors, pushing out old hands like Mark Culler and bringing in big names like Al Gore, Eric Schmidt from Google, and Mikey Drexler from The Gap. He's solidifying his position, once bitten, twice shy, or how we say in French, chat échaudé, craint l'eau froide. Jobs' return alone sends Apple shares soaring. He makes his public comeback at the Macworld Expo in Boston in '97. That's where he unveils his Think Different vision for getting Apple's innovation train moving again. The crowd goes wild. The media loves it. Jobs makes peace with Bill Gates and Microsoft, with whom Apple has been at odds for a long time. Microsoft agrees to make software for Apple and even invests 150 million without voting rights. By the end of the presentation, the stock has jumped 33%, the Jobs effect. Right on. Another stroke of genius, Jobs doesn't have any revolutionary new products to sell. He has cut down on the range and the losses, but he does put a lot of effort into a massive advertising campaign around his new slogan, Think Different. He digs a little deeper into the rebel and artist brand. On the production side, the portfolio is further narrowed down to 4 products, 2 desktop models and 2 portable models for professional and private use. Printers and servers are out. New mobile devices are yet to come. This change leads to some layoff, with over 3,000 people losing their jobs. Back in '97, Apple is on the brink of bankruptcy. But then, in early '98, Jobs does his famous one more little thing move. He announces that Apple is finally making a profit again. The iMac, with its bright colors and transparent design that shows off the inside of the machine, comes out in the summer of '98. It is a huge hit, selling close to 300,000 units in its first 6 weeks and 800,000 by the end of the year, an all-time record for a computer. Jobs, who is obsessed with controlling everything, knows this is hurting both his own health and the company's. So he hires Tim Cook, a former IBMer who had just joined Compaq, to be his director of operation and then his CEO. And this time it's the right fit. Tim Cook is an engineer and a logistics genius, and is also an old bachelor who's married to his job and leads a monk's life. Together, they cut inventories to the bone to ensure just-in-time production, further boosting the company's comfortable margins. Back in 1999, Jobs secretly started working on the downstream end of the value chain and the Apple's customers' shopping experience. This leads to the idea of the Apple Store, a really disruptive and successful project. The first Apple Store opened in Virginia in 2001. The store's design is pure and immaculate white, with polished wooden floors and a huge poster of John Lennon and Yoko Ono in bed, topped by the slogan, "Think Different." Now, there are 529 Apple stores in 26 countries. Another awesome idea is the Genius Bar, which offers 5 stars hotel-inspired customer service. Back in 2001, Apple survives the digital bubble bursting and is ready to lead a new revolution. Jobs comes up with the idea of the digital hub, where all your electronic devices like music players, recorders, and cameras could be controlled by one personal computer. This is made possible by FireWire, a technology Apple has been developing since the early 90s. It allows you to transfer data really quickly from one device to another. It is a winning strategy. Sales of new generation computers goes through the roof because of these new mobile devices. Now it comes to reinvent them, Apple style. It all starts with the software. Final Cut Pro and iMovie for video editing, iPhoto for photo storage, GarageBand for music creation and mixing, which I'm using to record and edit this podcast, and iTunes for managing your audio library. The music industry is then going through hell with the whole MP3 revolution and piracy with Napster and all the other peer-to-peer sites. Down to memory lane. I personally spent a lot of time as a teenager burning compilations of pirated music on CD. It was a revolution, but also a lot of admin. It's wild how technology can make you lazy. But let's go back to 2000. 320 million burnable CDs are sold in the US, when the population is just 281 million. Jobs sees the potential and doesn't just add a burner to the iMac, though. He buys SoundJam to turn it into iTunes and starts working on the iPod, the portable MP3 music player that will dynamite the market. The iPod has a small LCD screen, a rechargeable lithium battery, and most importantly, a miniature hard disk with enough memory to store 1,000 songs. The iPod also has the drop-down menu wheel and the lack of an on-off button that are characteristic of all the brand's devices, as well as the pure white of the device right down to the earphones that are supplied. It's a true gem of tech and design. Jobs reveals the iPod to the public in October 2001, and it was an instant hit. Even Gates admits that the iPod is brilliant. But it doesn't solve the existential crisis threatening the music industry. Jobs comes up with a business model that saves the industry, at least in part, with the iTunes Store and the 99-cent song. 70 cents of that goes to the labels and peanuts to the artists. Interesting fact, Sony, a major player in music production and technology, is then not able to innovate in this area. Their CEO just demands royalties from Apple on every iPod sold, but Jobs, of course, says, no thanks. And while Gates is complaining about Apple's success, Jobs launches his iTunes for Windows in 2003. In 2005, Apple is killing it thanks to iPod sales, which drives up Mac sales. But Jobs already sees the cell phone revolution as a threat that has to be mastered no matter what. The addition of a camera function is already killing the digital camera market, and adding an MP3 player to a cell phone would instantly kill its golden goose, the iPod. So he tries a partnership with Motorola to integrate an iPod into a new model. Luckily for Apple, Motorola's model turns out to be a flop, heavy, no memory, and basically a piece of junk, which leads to his usual conclusion, I really have to do everything myself. In fact, Jobs' genius only shines out in contrast to other incompetence. Yin and yang, he would like that. So Apple's gonna create this new music playing phone. They've actually been working on the multi-touch screen for a while as they acquired Fingerworks, a small super innovative Delaware company a while back. Jobs introduces the iPhone in early 2007 with these words: "Every so often, a revolutionary product is born that changes the face of the world." Today we present three revolutionary products. The first is an iPod with a large multi-touch screen. The second is an unrivaled cell phone. And the third is a totally new internet communication device. Got it? We're not talking about three different devices, but a single one, and we're calling it the iPhone. Some bloggers in the gigosphere are calling it the Jesus phone. By the end of 2010, Apple has sold 90 million iPhones, taking half the cell phone market in the process. As soon as the iPhone comes out, Jobs starts working on the iPad. The iPad comes out at the beginning of 2010, and the press is all over it. The Wall Street Journal even compares Jobs to Moses and writes, "The last time men showed so much fascination for a tablet, commandments were engraved on it." With the iPad, Jobs almost does the same thing to the press that he did to the music industry. The App Store creates a whole new content creation industry, and the iPad's large format is going to make it even bigger. With the iBook Store, the iPad is already becoming a reading device and a bookshop, slamming Amazon's Jeff Bezos since he wants to impose his low prices on the publishing world, where Jobs let them set their own prices, pocketing 30% in the process. But with the press, it's a whole different ballgame. Murdoch and the big bosses of the major publications know that their customer data are gold and don't want to let Apple get their hands on it. So there's no chance of a deal, and if newspapers do decide to charge for their digital editions, they're going to be way more expensive than the $5 that Jobs recommends. Just imagine a second if Apple had really changed the newspaper's business model. Would social networks have blown out too? Would they have influenced information, especially misinformation, and changed the whole democratic process? In short, would Trump be president? Nothing is for sure. But let's go back to France and Xavier Niel's genius idea. Back in 1996, France passes a law to deregulate telecommunication, which paves the way for new operators to emerge. Niel totally gets that a proprietary network would be a cash cow, and that's when his free access business model really takes off. He says, "You can ditch the subscription fee since your money comes from the local calls. I create a micro network, and that will be enough to share the revenue with the existing operator." He calls the Direction Générale des Télécoms to announce his intention to become an operator, but the guy cannot believe the audacity of this little unknown jerk who doesn't seem to understand that the battle is going to be played out between giants like Veolia, Vivendi, and SNCF. But little Xav doesn't give up, and with four guys recruited from forums, sets about creating Free, the first free and ad-free internet service provider. Misika doesn't believe him. So Niel reminds him that Apple created the iPhone with a team of 15 people. He also mentions the two-pizza rule, which was conceptualized by Jeff Bezos. He says that if you need more than two pizzas to feed a team, they're too many. You don't need to be a lot, you just need the right people. The guy who started Netflix came up with something similar, calling it talent density. When the dot-com bubble burst in 2001, he had to let go of a third of his employees. He's worried it will ruin his company and the morale of those who stay. But a few months later, he realizes they're actually doing better and everyone's happier. They've kept only the best, and when you put brilliant people together, they help each other grow. So Niel has an epiphany about his all-inclusive offer. At a time when ADSL is emerging, I'm starting to wonder what internet access represents for the user. The network that carries the data must be able to be used for something other than connecting a computer, but what else? It can carry sound and images, and sound equals telephone, and image equals TV. He finally gets his operating license from the regulator, but it wasn't easy. Luckily for Niel, the big groups aren't interested, and With its arrogance, France Télécom has alienated the regulatory authority. So, in revenge, the regulator decides to strictly apply the law, which in no way prevents Niel and his crew from trying their luck. France Télécom is legally obliged to lease its telephone lines, so it has to do so. With his idea for an all-in-one box, he and his friends set off for California, convinced that the Yanks already has one. They meet with equipment manufacturers but come up empty-handed. The Americans don't get his genius idea. He goes to Google, which just started up, and he comes very close to making a deal with Sergey Brin for free to exploit the Google license in France. It's wild. Anyway, if he hasn't bought Google, he understands that he has to build his own magic box that doesn't exist anywhere else. When they get back to France, Alcatel tells them, okay, guys, you're cute, but your ID, the internet, and all, it's science fiction. It's not what people want. True visionary guys. So much that at that point, Alcatel is starting to collapse. One of the guys in Niel's gang remembers his friends from college who is good at electronics, and in no time they recruit him to design the first Freebox in 2001. As with Apple, Niel defines his approach as follows. Free's manufacturing secret is very simple, but it's hard to put into practice. We do everything ourselves. First of all, we make all the software and hardware for the box ourselves. In fact, they rely on open source software and components, and that's probably where he differs most from Jobs and perhaps brings him closer to Wozniak. Niel is a firm believer in this logic of openness and sharing, of collective intelligence. Free has largely embraced it and been nourished by it. In short, the box is released in 2002. Well, it isn't perfect, as Niel himself admits. It weighs 3 tons, the power supply burns a bit too easily, but it does the 3 things we ask it to do: internet, phone, and TV. And it's a world first. To general indifference, at least in France. The international media are the first to talk about it. It's a classic. When something positive happens in France, our media miss it, and it's the international media that sound the alarm. Between 2002 and 2005, it was word of mouth that made the box a success. Users were talking about it long before the media. The free box is not only a technological innovation, but also a complete breakthrough in terms of pricing, he brags. Compared to the competition, the difference is spectacular because each service is sold separately. 45 euros for internet, 30 euros for telephone, 30 euros for television, compared to our 29.99 euros subscription. Plus, the box offers new services such as unlimited local calls and VOD. Once again, Niel plays his pricing game with genius. At first, it charges international calls, but he explains. Very quickly, we started to make unlimited extra for international calls free because we discovered an interesting trick. If you offer a package of channels from a country and unlimited calls to that country, you capture the entire community living in France. When we launched unlimited calls to China, the entire Chinese community subscribed to our service. In short, the box is a hit and makes a lot of people jealous. Patrick Lelay, the head of TF1, which is the first television network, offers to buy it, as did Lagardère, another media mogul. But Niel, confident in his business plan of 100% market share, sticks to its gun, ready to welcome new competitors. Round 6, Troubles. Steve Jobs has his share of problems, not the least, and often of his own making. Starting with his impossible character, his stubbornness, and his megalomaniacal arrogance, what Apple's historical collaborators call, with a nod to Star Trek, his distortion field. This ability, in short, to put the cart before the horse, to force destiny, or to fake it until you make it. And that's what has driven him and his flock to surpass themselves and achieve the impossible. Above all, it has driven many mad. As one software developer puts it, in his presence, reality becomes malleable. He can make you believe almost anything. The effect certainly dissipates when he's not there, but it seriously prevents you from making realistic predictions about anything. On this subject, I'd like to recommend another series, Dropout, which tells the story of the huge fraud perpetrated by Theranos, a startup founded in 2003 by Elizabeth Holmes, a very young Stanford dropout, on the promise of a machine capable of making hundreds of diagnoses from a single drop of blood. A huge Jobs fan, she imitated his famous unchanging black turtleneck, jeans and sneakers look, but above all, in his delirious field of reality distortion. That's how she managed to raise huge amounts of money, contract all sorts of partnerships, and to become very rich without ever producing the slightest result. Worse, she has hastily disguised a competing machine, making false diagnoses and endangering the health of thousands of patients. In short, the chick is an absolute sociopath who is luckily in prison for a while, although she tried to escape by throwing under the bus her ex and partner and by having 2 kids in a hurry. It's disgusting. Jobs at least has the talent, the vision, and the means, often at the expense of others, to realize his ambitions. Rise up until the moment things start to go wrong. Most notably in '84, when sales of the Macintosh begin to slow just 6 months after its resounding launch. In fact, Jobs, overconfident in his design and the beauty of his graphical interface, rushes out an extremely slow machine with no internal hard drive and only one floppy drive, listening only to his aesthetic whims. In short, not so great. And the bromance Jobs has begun with the new CEO and ex-Pepsi turns sour. I won't go into too much detail here, but it's worthy of the show's succession. From board meeting that turns into dramas to manipulations, pressure tactics, threats, pleas, insults, conspiracies, and crying fits from Jobs who can stand to be resisted like the spoiled rotten baby he is, to the final coup that ends with his outright ousting in the summer of '85. Officially, he is still chairman until the moment he hires key Apple personnel to launch his next university computer project with him and sells all his Apple shares, in clear violation of the agreement he has signed with the Apple board, which has no choice but to take him to court. With Next, he repeats the same mistakes. An obsession with design at the expense of economic efficiency, dictatorial management, and a distortion of reality that leads him to rush out a machine that simply isn't ready. But it's on the health front that the most serious problems arise. In 2003, he develops kidney stones, and his urologist asks him to have a scan, which reveals a shadow on his pancreas. Another scan confirms a tumor, and a biopsy confirms good news. It is a neuroendocrine tumor of the pancreas, not the full-blown cancer doctors fear, but a rare condition that develops slowly and is therefore curable. If caught early, the tumor can be easily removed by surgery. But he stubbornly refuses the surgery. And this is the absolute tragedy of the ideologization of health issues and the catastrophic damage caused by disinformation that challenges science and medicine in favor of so-called alternative medicines, from homeopathy to naturopathy to shamanism, which are in fact nothing more than magical thinking and pure fraud. For the record, it is in this great cesspool of so-called spirituality and well-being that sectarian movements are developing most rapidly and most massively, a phenomenon that has been exacerbated by the pandemic and the totally delirious proliferation of anti-vaxxer movements. In short, Jobs, the gifted, the billionaire, the ultra-informed, has access to the best of the best in medical care and treatment, and makes a conscious decision to forgo the operation that would probably have cured him for good. He thinks he's gonna cure himself with an even stricter vegetarian diet based on carrots and fruit juices, acupuncture, a medium, and a naturopath who gives him enemas. In short, a real bullshit plan. Much to the despair of his wife, who can't persuade him to seek real treatment. He loses 9 months. After which, at the urging of everyone around him, he finally agrees to have another scan. And of course, the tumor has grown. He undergoes surgery, but it is probably too late. And because part of his pancreas, the organ that secretes the enzymes the stomach needs to digest food and absorb nutrients, has to be removed, he has to stop his crazy diet and go back to eating animal protein, which of course he doesn't. Unfortunately, during the operation, the doctors discovers 3 metastases in his liver. As he approaches the age of 50, he is in bad shape, and this in the greatest secrecy. He tells his biographer, "The reminder that I would soon be dead was an essential driving force in helping me to make the biggest decisions of my life. Because almost everything, expectations, pride, fear of embarrassment or failure, disappears in the face of death. And all that's left is what really matters. Remembering that you're going to die is the best way to avoid the trap of thinking you have anything to lose. We're already naked, so why not listen to your heart?" It's hopeless and it's getting worse. I've been on threads since I started this podcast, and the anti-science, anti-vaxxer rhetoric is just everywhere. And you poor Americans are entering the very dark ages with your new anti-science administration. But back to Jobs. Surgery and chemotherapy gives him only a short reprieve, and by 2008 his cancer has spread. But the genome of his cancer has been partially sequenced, the benefit of being a Silicon Valley billionaire, allowing his doctor to treat it with targeted therapies. But his eating disorders are worse than ever, and he loses a lot of weight, making his case even worse. And the truth about his health is finally revealed in the press, which begins to worry the markets. Apple share price plummets. Apple announced that Jobs is not coming to the Macworld Expo, and Jobs publishes an open letter mentioning hormone problems. True, of course, but he leaves out the most important news, his cancer, which is now an open secret. And lying about it becomes legally problematic when you run a public company. Job's only hope is a liver transplant, but he is put on a waiting list in California and has little chance of receiving one in time because of his rare blood type and the fact that preference was given to patients who have a better chance of recovery. Job's wife becomes an expert on the subject. The law allows people to be on the waiting list in 2 states at the same time, provided that they can get to the hospital within 8 hours, which Jobs can do with his private plane. Again, the privilege of status. She chooses Tennessee, which has one of the best transplant services in the world. And so begins a race against time, with doctors predicting that Job's liver will not last much longer. In March, tragedy strikes the family of a young donor who dies in a car accident. But it's a miracle for Jobs, who is finally at the top of the waiting list. On the subject of organ donation, I highly recommend Maëlys de Kerangal's wonderful book, Men the Living. It's a very accurately documented, superbly empathetic, and just plain beautiful human fresco. The transplant is successful, but the surgeons find metastases in the peritoneum and suspect that the cancer has spread elsewhere. He is able to return to Palo Alto at the end of May 2009, but is depressed. Apple is doing well without him, the share price has risen, Tim Cook is doing very well and winning praise, which offends the Apple founder. Perhaps that's what gives him the eye of the tiger, because he manages to make a triumphant return at an Apple event in September. At the beginning of 2010, he is back to work with a goal to launch the iPad. But by the end of the year, he is again in poor health, not eating, wasting away, and has to be fed intravenously. His general condition, both physically and mentally, has deteriorated too much for him to consider any new treatment that he would not be able to take. His wife tries to get him to see a shrink and take antidepressants, but Jobs stubbornly refuses and wallows in his agony. It's terrible for him, but also for his wife and children, who are powerless witnesses to his hell. And all this even though he is very privileged. He is one of the first 20 people in the world to have his tumor genes and DNA completely sequenced. This process, which cost more than $100,000, holds great promise for targeted molecular therapy, which is less invasive than chemo. This prompted Jobs to say, either I'm going to be one of the first to succeed in stopping this kind of cancer, or I'm going to be one of the last to die from it, the first to reach the shore or the last to drown on the way. Sadly, in July 2011, the cancer spreads to his bones and other parts of his body. He attends his last board meeting in a wheelchair to tender his resignation as CEO. Emotions runs high. He is saying goodbye to Apple. At their last meeting, he confides to his biographer, I like to think that something survives when we die. It's strange to accumulate all this experience and a little wisdom, only to have it all disappear. So I really want to believe that something lasts. Maybe our consciousness. But then again, maybe it's like an on-off switch. Click and nothing more. Maybe that's why I've never liked on-off switches on Apple products. Steve Jobs dies on October 5, 2001, surrounded by his family. Xavier Niel is healthy, but also has known dark days. Free's IPO in January 2004 is a huge success, with the share price rising 30% on its first listing. Niel and his success are increasingly visible, which is source of jealousy. On May 25, 2004, the police arrives at his home at 6 a.m. to take Niel into custody. The charges against him are very serious. Misuse of company assets, money laundering, and pimping. The investigation is launched after a Bulgarian group accused Niel of defrauding them when he bought OneTel after the dot-com bubble burst in the early 2000s. According to Niel, the case was sitting quietly on the judge's desk, but is brought to light when Free's IPO is announced. However, as we've seen, Xav takes a few liberties with the law and isn't exactly squeaky clean with his shady historical shareholder who is involved in sex shops. And there's a lot of cash in circulation, which means that taxes and fees are avoided. Niel, who has cleaned his assets, says he made the mistake of not selling all of the shady ones, but he is caught up in the justice system and goes to custody. They search my house all morning. At 2 p.m., they raid Free's headquarters and take me from floor to floor in handcuffs. And at the end of the day, they take me away, where I have some pretty nice conversation with the cops for 2 days. They only give you food and water if you behave. They take away your belt and shoelaces so you don't kill yourself. You don't get a lawyer and you don't get a cell phone. So you cut off from the world for 48 hours. After 2 days in police custody, he is brought before Judge Van Ruymbeck, who announces that he is under investigation and the magistrate orders his arrest. He ends up in prison, where he is quickly placed in an individual cell in the VIP section, because his arrest has made the headlines. With unbridled optimism, he describes his time in prison as not so bad. He walks out, loses weight. After 15 days, he sees the judge again, hoping to be released. But Van Ruymbeck is a hardliner and keeps him in jail. Even though he was able to verify Niel's statement and see that he was telling the truth, in fact, he's sure he'll find offshore accounts to nail Niel and uses this excuse to keep him in prison for another 15 days while he investigates. Although he takes things in stride and without anger, Niel still describes the sordid side of his situation, especially when he goes before the judge. It's a series of very unpleasant strip searches. You end up in the mousetrap of the courthouse, which is the worst place I know. It's filthy, unsanitary, full of rats. You leave at 8 a.m. in the morning to see the judge for half an hour around 11 a.m. and you're back in your cell at 5 p.m. It's exhausting and humiliating. So after 1 month in custody, Niel is released. At the end of his trial in 2006, Niel is sentenced to 2 years probation and fined 250,000 euros for managing social abuse. He has become an outcast and has a strong desire for revenge and to clear his name. It is a life lesson for him. The prison, the police custody, the trial, the blackmail. It was a great cleansing of my life. You know you're not invisible anymore. All your false friends ran away, and the only ones who are there when you are at the bottom of the hole are your family, your loved ones. It changes the way you see the world, the way you operate. It's pretty good. When Free dynamites the mobile phone market, it does so painfully. The three incumbent operators sharing the pie has agreed on prices and shamelessly charge the highest rates in Europe, despite the condemnation of the French Competition Authority. President Sarkozy administration launches the creation of a fourth operator to stimulate growth. The anti-free lobby at the time is extremely hostile, but in the 2009 tender, Free is the only candidate. As Free doesn't yet have its own network, it has no choice but to sign a roaming agreement with an incumbent operator. It is the arrival of Stéphane Richard at the head of Orange, the new name of France Télécom, that unblocks the situation. He realizes that it is better to make a deal with Free than to wait for the regulator to force him to do so, considering that if he lets the wolf into the henhouse, the roaming contract will still earn him a few billion. There, we are back in a Succession episode. Martin Bouygues, who is one of the biggest players in French economy and one of the existing operator, tries everything to get him to drop the case, and Niel receives anonymous phone calls threatening his children if he doesn't give up. But fed up, Niel, hardened by prisons, goes ahead and launches his €2 package. I waited until the very end of the launch press conference to announce it, much like Steve Jobs says one more thing at Apple keynotes. To keep the suspense going, I asked the journalists to look under the seats. They found a €2 coin. It was stuck there. It had a small effect. A huge success, of course, with 1 million subscriptions on the first day and extensive media coverage, except from TF1, owned by Bouygues. Round 7, Private Life. We learn a lot about the women in Steve Jobs' life in his biography. His high school sweetheart, Chris Brennan, is a hippie he meets again after returning from India and lives with for a while on his farm/sect. She occasionally sleeps with Jobs and another guy. She moves into a room in the house he rents with a buddy, even though they're not officially together, and as had to happen, she gets pregnant. They're both 23, the exact same age as Jobs' biological parents when he was born. But Jobs has just started his Apple adventure and is not interested in this situation. He even goes into pregnancy denial, using his reality distortion field. When he finally confronts the problems, he asks her to have an abortion, but refuses the option of adoption. She finally gets out of there because Jobs is obnoxious to her and goes to the farm to give birth. Lisa is born on May 87. Mother and daughter move into a slum, living on government subsidies, and it's the county that sues Jobs for financial compensation. When the little girl turns 1, Jobs agrees to take a paternity test just before Apple's IPO. The California court orders Jobs to child support and to reimburse the county of nearly $6,000. He's been acting like a jerk the whole time, denying the DNA test results and tearing Brennan's reputation apart. He says in retrospect, I would have preferred to act differently. I couldn't see myself as a father at the time. I bought a house in Palo Alto to house them. Her mother found the best school for Lisa, and I paid for it. If I had to do it all over again, I would do it differently and better. For me, it's a tricky issue. Sure, motherhood is a woman's responsibility, and it's clear to me that women should always have the final say over their body. No issue there. But imposing unwanted paternity on men without any means to bear a child alone doesn't seem very fair to me, nor is it responsible for the child to come. Contraception and abortions are legal at the time, and Brennan has no money, no job, no plans, and is quite cuckoo banana herself. Not cool for little Lisa, who finds herself in between a battered mother and a father who loses interest in her until she's 8, when she starts showing a talent for writing. When Jobs is kicked out of Apple, he sets up Next headquarters 2 steps from their house. The girl is the spitting image of her father, and he develops a relationship with her, regularly taking her out to lunch, rollerblading, and on business trips, as in Tokyo. But Jobs and his daughter share the same hot temper. Their relationship is always going to be complicated. Jobs is a passionate guy in every area of his life. When it comes to women, he is either head over heels or obnoxious. He has one passionate romance after another, especially with John Bass, who is 14 years older than him, but it didn't work out because he wants to start a family. When his mom is dying of lung cancer, she tells him a little bit more about his birth mom. At the same time, Jobs secretly starts a search, hiring a private detective and tracking down the doctor on his birth certificate. He doesn't learn the identity of his birth mom until after the doctor's death. When his adoptive mother died, he decides to go further. The private detective has located Joanne in Los Angeles, and Job finally meets her. Joanne, who has never quite gotten over giving up her first child, tells Jobs that he's got a sister, Mona, who's making her way in the writing business in New York. The two meet, hit it off, and never let go. In late 89, he is heartbroken when his girlfriend of the time turns down his marriage proposal for fear of being consumed by his madness. It is then that he meets Lauren Powell, a young graduate of Stanford Business School, where he is invited for a conference. It is love at first sight. The daughter of a Marine who died a hero, she endured her mother's second marriage to an asshole and learned the lesson of never accepting a mismatch for lack of financial independence. After working as a financial analyst at Goldman Sachs on the East Coast, she enrolls at Stanford and meets Jobs. They fall madly in love, and by the end of the 90s, she is pregnant and they are married. The secret sauce of their union is that Lauren isn't neurotic enough to suffer Job's outbursts, and she's smart enough to channel them. She also shares some of his food obsessions and has even started her own brand of organic, ready to eat meals. She welcomes Lisa into her home when the school alerts Jobs that the teenager's life with her toxic mother is too unstable. Lauren takes her under her wing. The girl blossoms and is accepted to Harvard at the end of high school. Lauren and Jobs have 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls, and live happily together until Jobs' tragic death. Niel doesn't talk about his private life at all in his book. His first wife and mother of his eldest sons is the very discreet Catherine Samama, legal director of Iliad. Since 2010, he has been sharing his life with Delphine Arnault, with whom he has a daughter and a third son, making them quite a power couple. In fact, Delphine Arnault is the daughter of Bernard Arnault, first wealthiest in France and third in the world, and powerful boss of LVMH. Director of Dior since 2023, it is she who should take the reins of the family empire when daddy hangs up. In his book, Niel admits to living a very privileged life. He lives with his family in a replica of the Petit Trianon in the 16th arrondissement, a very chic neighborhood in Paris, but far, far away from the antics of tech billionaires led by Elon Musk, whom he doesn't much like. My life is obviously that of a very privileged person, but I don't think it's very different from anyone else. I don't eat caviar for breakfast. I go to the office to work. I send emails. I have meetings. I make phone calls. I see friends. I take care of my children. Niel's sons are also making their mark in their father's group. Jules, the eldest at 23, works in cost management at the headquarters of NGG, the family holding company. And John, 22, has joined the board of directors of Le Monde Foundation and launched his own fintech startup. But Niel is not a big believer in the entrepreneurial dynasty model and advocates greater freedom in inheritance rules that require at least 75% of one's wealth to be passed on to heirs. Not all children are cut out to manage large estates. Giving your children a few million is an opportunity, giving them billions is a burden. The entrepreneurial spirit is not transmitted. Of course, some children turn out to be great entrepreneurs like their parents, but it's not a matter of DNA. Some kids just don't know how. Round 8, Changing the World. Steve Jobs certainly changed the world by getting the fledgling computer industry off the ground and giving geeks of his ilk a cool, rebellious image. As we've seen, he's never stopped innovating and shaking up the market. To Apple's benefit, of course, but also against humming monopolies, whether in computing, music, or any form of content creation. But money doesn't interest him much, so he's not a philanthropist. He did set up a foundation, but quickly lost interest in it, despising the humanitarians and their sanctimonious hypocrisy. On the other hand, he makes secret donations, for example, to research into endemic diseases in the third world. And he gives his parents a bundle of shares, putting them out of business for good. He's interested in education, which he finds terribly outdated, and he sees the immense possibilities that digital technology offers for the dissemination of knowledge. His great ambition, which his illness has prevented him to realize, is to replace school textbook with free iPads. He has little interest in politics, which he sees as dominated by incompetence. But when he meets Obama, he argues in favor of facilitating the training of engineers by granting permanent visas to foreign students. He believes that we need to facilitate trainings pathways through basic channels such as community colleges and technical schools, and that this is the only way to relocate the IT industry, what Obama, hamstrung by a Republican Congress, can do. Niel invests and builds in all directions, not only out of strategy but also out of passion. When Misika asks him why he invested in the media, he has this simple answer: because I like it. You've got people who love soccer. When they get rich, the first thing they buy is a soccer club. Well, it's the same for me, but with the media. When he's dealing with the media of his competitors like TF1 and Bouygues, who are giving him a hard time during his legal troubles, he figures out a way to avoid them using the press for their own agendas. At a time when the internet is shaking up the old economic model of the traditional newspapers, Niel is helping out new players in the online press, covering the whole political spectrum, not to be accused of propaganda. And he saves a bunch of newspapers from going bankrupt, including Le Monde, one of the most important French daily newspapers. In 2010, Mathieu Pigasse asked him to join forces to take over the group, and they teamed up with Pierre Berger, the man behind Yves Saint Laurent. Berger has the advantage of being well established in the intellectual leftist Parisian elite. Niel says the pairing is odd but complementary. Mathieu has the idea, I have the money, and Pierre has the culture. They have the bright idea to create a structure that would guarantee editorial independence, and they succeed. They manage to make the paper profitable while increasing the number of journalists to improve the editorial offering and gain market share. Niel and his gang are cleaning up the contracts, solving the printing problem, and above all, helping the title make a success of its digital turn. Investing in good ideas, promoting goodwill, and making the world a better place. This is what drives a billionaire. Since 1998, he has invested in countless startups. In 2010, he launches his own investment fund, Kima Ventures, using the simple method of risk spreading with limited investment in about 100 startups a year, making him one of the world's most prolific investors in terms of number of equity investments. His philosophy: we don't fund success, we fund progress. What matters is that entrepreneurs make progress, because talent is recycled and will create the value of tomorrow in their next company or elsewhere. With Station F, Niel sets out to build the world's largest startup incubator, inaugurated in 2017 with the newly elected President Macron. The New York Times runs a front page story on the event as proof of the return of innovation to France. At the same time, Niel is tackling education, a huge undertaking for a kid who didn't like school. In 2013, he opens École 42, a kind of second chance school for training in programming and digital technical professions that is free and accessible without diploma requirements. These schools comes mainly from my own experience. I didn't get ahead in the classroom, but I learned to code, and that allowed me to succeed professionally. If this model worked for me, why wouldn't it work for others? And his school is a meritocratic model that welcomes dropouts, people with disabilities, and guys from shady neighborhoods. But it works because each class is handpicked for motivation, work ethic, and talent. Out of nearly 100,000 applicants per year, only 1,000 are returned after a drastic selection process. Today, École 42 has 55 locations in 25 countries. Not bad. Niel is also interested in agriculture, animal welfare, and ecology. With Teract, an association which brings together 300,000 French farmers, he wants to promote the transition of agriculture. The same goes for Hectare, a campus dedicated to the agriculture of the future, established in 2020 on farmland acquired by Niel near Paris. The idea is to promote innovation in the agricultural sector. France needs farmers. Half of France's 400,000 farmers will retire in the next 10 years. 100,000 will not find replacements. So we have to find them outside the world of agriculture. We need to innovate, experiment with new models, and attract young people to these professions. Feeding people while respecting the planet seems incredibly important. Niel also defends animal welfare. He explains that it is when one of his sons decides to stop eating meat that he becomes interested in the issue as a grandson of a butcher. These initiatives, including a stake in startups specializing in the production of plant proteins, makes Niel the figurehead of a so-called conspiracy against French farmers and the livestock industry for his far-right opponents, who lump him together with transhumanists, Silicon Valley billionaires. Niel finds this rather amusing, and it reinforces his beliefs that we need to innovate to feed everyone on the planet without worsening climate change. In short, the optimistic Niel believes in progress. All my life, I've believed that technology will save the world. It may be naive, but I still believe it. There are hundreds of companies working on carbon capture, and one of them will find the solution and is investing in it. One of these companies, Carbon Drop, founded by Stanford researchers, is working on carbon capture using genetically modified algae. Niel is also betting on AI, and in 2023 he launched a 300 million euro research lab, QTI. His ambition: I just want the AI that our children will use not to be based solely on American or Chinese models. We have a responsibility to give back a little of what French has given us. I want to boost the whole AI ecosystem in France. His recipe is to pay his researchers well to keep them, but above all, offer them the freedom to publish, share, and collaborate that they wouldn't find in the GAFAMs. Once again, open source, collective intelligence. And given the potential and proven abuses of AI, particularly when it creates disinformation and disrupts the democratic process, Niel has the wisdom of age and experience not to panic. AI can create political fakes, but it can also detect them. And if I detect them, I can report them and remove them. Every technology creates a counter technology. It's a cat and mouse game. I was a computer hacker 40 years ago, and I saw how countermeasures were developed. Cybercrime has spawned a cybersecurity industry with colossal revenues. Soon you'll be able to detect deepfakes in seconds. And when it's published, people will integrate it into their perception and judgment. Maybe a bit too much optimistic, Xav, because we now see what Musk and Zuckerberg are doing, avoiding their editorial responsibilities by criminalizing social media moderation and fact-checking, and allowing hate and ignorance to flourish. Last round, verdict. So, of course, we can't compare the global giant that is Apple with Free, even though Niel is buying up operators abroad by the dozen, becoming a global player in the telephony market. But the similarities between the two are striking. A happy childhood, loving parents, passionate and self-taught geeks, a bit of a rebel and rock and roll, incredible flair, ironclad self-confidence and work ethic, and the ability to go through anything and come out stronger. and also a balanced family life. In short, if Niel the optimist is more generous, doesn't forget where we come from, and tries to revive meritocracy, isn't he above all a product of the French Republic, the Trente Glorieuses, May 68 cultural liberation, but also of that revolutionary France that hates privilege and despises individual success? Similarly, isn't Jobs a pure product of the Silicon Valley America of the 60s and 70s, geeky and hippie, but above all liberal when it suits him and super individualistic? Stay tuned, because if Steve Jobs' destinies comes to an end in 2011, Xavier Niel may still have some surprises in store for us. Thank you for listening. I hope you are not too annoyed by my accent. If you enjoy this podcast, be sure to subscribe, give it a star, leave a comment. Also, feel free to follow the Book Fight Club on Insta, Facebook, Threads, Blue Sky, and let me know about any jewels you would like to see translated in the future. See you then for the next episode. Allez, à plus!